Welcome to tonight's meeting.
All of us, I think, have our differences with how things are run. And I think the problem with democracy in Europe is perhaps best summed up by two words, and that's Europhile and Eurosceptic. First thing to note about these two words is that they're not actually opposites, right? It's like I say, did you see that girl? I think I'm in love with her. And Declan says, I don't think she exists. The debate should not be whether you are skeptical or in love, right? I mean, there's lots of ways to love, first of all, and there's tough love and there's blind love, and the idea that you're either sort of for it or against it is, I think, very harmful to the very idea of democracy. There are two things, I think, at the core of democracy. One of them is the notion of a loyal opposition. The roots of the terror in France lay in the inadequacy of the notion of a loyal opposition. The second thing, I think, is you need to be able to reverse the victories of the other side if you come into power, right? In Britain, this is embodied in the notion that no parliament may bind its successors. The EU runs along somewhat different lines. Once decisions are taken, once they are approved and ratified, they are assumed in many cases to have been taken for all time. Europe, to be democratic, needs to somehow incorporate both of these concepts better, both into their discourse and into their decision-making. This is a point where perhaps Declan and I have some disagreement. I think it's actually very difficult to create an effectual democracy in a place as large and diverse and populous as Europe. It can't be no to Europe or yes to Europe. It has to be what kind of Europe, how much of it, and what are the limits.
Both Europhiles and Eurosceptics seem keen to absolve national governments of responsibility. The Europhile does it by kowtowing to Brussels, and the Eurosceptic does it by blaming the EU for almost everything that goes wrong. And what they share in common is a belief that responsibility lies with the EU, an instinct to say national governments are not to blame. And in answer to the question, did the EU kill democracy, I would say no, it didn't. The EU is better understood as the end product of the death of democracy in Europe, as it's a creation of national governments that had given up on the ideas of sovereignty and democracy. The benefit of the EU is that it allowed governments to take action without having to bother with pesky public debate or with taking moral responsibility. And of course, the downsides to this insulated decision-making are enormous and profound. Because the more that national governments insulated themselves from their publics, the more incapable they became of exercising real leadership. The growth of the idea that political leadership is too hard and technocratic decision-making is preferable has directly worsened the euro crisis. The real problem is the thing which gave rise to the EU in the first place and which still exists, which is the estrangement of national political elites from their peoples. And if we address that and fight to hold our own leaders to account, we might just challenge the crisis of leadership in Europe and put both rationality and people's interests back on the political agenda.
People talk about the democratic deficit within the European Union. I don't think there is one, because there was never meant to be one, because it was designed to be thoroughly undemocratic. Democracy emerged because of the emergence of the nation-state at the same time, because democracy can only exist within a nation-state. It can't exist beyond the nation-state because there's no commonality of understanding, language, and other issues. Postmodernists would tell us that the nation-state is out of date. Well, it certainly isn't. What the globalisation has told them is that the nation-state can't have any power. And that's just not true. The European Union is against self-determination. It is against sovereignty. It wants to roll back democracy not just from the gains of the Second World War. It wants to roll back the gains of the French Revolution, the whole concept of self-determination.
Wolfgang Schäuble, when they first started to construct the euro, the single currency, he outlined what the intention was at the time, which was, in his view, to have a monetary union that then became a fiscal union, and then became a political union, and would eventually lead to a directly elected president of Europe. And in that sense, it becomes perhaps more democratic than where we are today. And I usually have a very simple litmus test for this, which is if you asked an American where they were from, they would say America. And then they would tell you what state they were from. If you asked a European, you would tell me you were from Greece or Britain or Italy or wherever. And I think until being European is your first answer, the people have a long way to go before we're down that political road. Where I do think there are problems in terms of democracy and the EU is the way in which this particular crisis has actually shown how democratically elected leaders can't seem to serve the role that they're supposed to. Very few European leaders have been able to explain, persuade, lead their people through the tough austerity measures to make them believe that this is warranted. And this is why you have the rise of the technocrats. To me, that's a very worrying development.
I'll put my cards on the table. I'm a European federalist. The single biggest achievement of the European project since the end of the Second World War is that it has, by and large, managed to secure the peace. It's really, really good that my generation is not going to have to dress up in uniforms and go out and meet other guys from my generation and start shooting at each other across some battlefield in Europe. I am very worried that the Europe that we are heading toward is a Europe that is more a Europe of Robespierre than it is a Europe of Edmund Burke. The sovereignty of the individual and more power is being passed to institutions in the centre and away from the citizen. We have to dramatically reform this now. We have to create competition, a competition of big ideas. And the institution to do that with is by combining the presidency of the Commission and the Council and making that position open to competition and to election. You need to balance the European Parliament properly so that the member states, it better reflects population, so it's fairer to the large countries, but you balance out the interests of the smaller countries in the creation of a European Senate where every state has an equal number of seats. Now, before you can do any of that stuff, the cancer that is eating away at the European project right now is that of insolvency. You have to deal with that first. And we have to embrace the idea of bankruptcy again in Europe, that we allow the freedom to fail for financial institutions that cannot continue. We cannot transfer pre-failed risk to taxpayers.
You've all, in your different ways, and you're not alone in recognising now the democratic problems with a lot of the European institutions. But nonetheless, at the same time, people in European countries from Ireland to Greece want to stay in the euro.
In one of the Federalist Papers, it says if men were angels, we wouldn't need government. I think if technocrats were angels, we wouldn't need democracy, right? And we have democracy because all of us, including our leaders, are fallible. They make mistakes. There are disagreements, and some of those disagreements are unreconcilable. In spirit, I totally agree with Declan that in practice, I think we're a long way from, even linguistically, being able to have those debates across all of Europe. If the technocratic EU model were perfect, we could have a one-world government and everybody would be happy, but nobody wants that.
We need to distinguish when we talk about Europe and the EU, because these are very different things. Europe is a great thing. We all agree on that. The EU is a terrible thing. It's a coalition of elites. It's not a coalition of peoples. And that's why I disagree with Declan. I don't think it is reformable. It needs to be done away with, which is why I wish we did have a Europe of Robespierre, because then maybe there'd be a few revolutionaries willing to get rid of the ancient regime that the national elites have created in the EU.
Now, if you look at where the euro crisis is at, all the talk is of more EU cross-border institutions like a fund to resolve banks. If the leaders haven't done enough of a job to decide, first of all, where the Eurozone or the EU is going, then they can't bring anybody along. If this really is a political project to make Europe like a federal Europe, eventually down the line, like the United States, then there has to be a very clear delineation of responsibilities, powers at the state and at the federal level.
If there was any treaty that Europe needed immediately, that Ireland needed immediately today to sign up to, it would be a liberalisation of bankruptcy laws across the European Union so that these financial institutions could be allowed to go through the insolvency purge. Because unless we do that, the whole of insolvency, I am very concerned, is going to keep getting deeper.
You know, Declan talked about war in Europe. I mean, it's an interesting case study. John Major tried to get an opt-out in the single currency. Germany said, you can have your opt-out, but you must recognise Croatia, which led to the biggest war in the Balkans since World War II. So the EU created that war because of the horse trading that goes on within the power structures of the European Union. And I think that's what's going on now. The EU is being used by Germany to basically become a colonial overlord of the rest of Europe. And what the EU has actually done, slowly after the last 20 years, is reverse the results of World War II.
I differ not only from UKIP, but also from the left-wing opposition to the EU, because what I think the right and the left opponents of the EU have in common is this rather shallow kind of anti-globalisation, panic about outsiders, this idea that we're under attack from American banks or Brussels diktat. I see the EU not as this kind of external evil entity that threatens civilization, and certainly not as a kind of German colonial overlord, but as the creation of our own governments conning us and outsourcing authority away from our nations and away from the people to an external institution.
I think we both agree that this is a general malaise of politics in Europe.
But you did talk about the German colonial overlord.
If you look at the history of what's going on in terms of Germany's doing very well out of the situation. The only reason that there's growth in Europe is because there's one country in Europe that has got growth, and it's called Germany. That's an objective fact. That's not me saying that being David Icke.
I don't think democracy is an end in itself. I think that the maximum freedom for the maximum number of people ought to be the end in itself, and a democracy can be tyrannical. Self-determination, not collective determination, would be my priority, and if the technocrats were angels, they would recognize that and they'd leave us to our own devices. More broadly, I think the EU works best when it brings the people negative freedoms, right? The freedom to move around, to move their money, to move their goods, to sell their wares across the whole continent. It's the most controversial, and it does the most harm when it starts encroaching on everybody's freedoms in the name of equality.
Because of the increasingly globalized world, this notion that you need to have cross-border or supranational institutions, this is an issue everywhere. So if you want global trade, you need to have some body to resolve trade disputes that isn't based on the rule of the mighty over the rule of the weak.
The internal market and the free movement of goods, services and capital and labour are going to prolong this crisis. The four freedoms are not freedoms, they're a disaster. Capital has got the power to wander anywhere it can around Europe, and labour, people, are reduced to camp followers of capital where they've got to follow where the money goes. That is not rational. That is pre-democratic ideas. Now, what we should do is that those four so-called freedoms should be under democratic control of electorates.
One problem with the warping of the no sentiment and with this kind of anti-Merkel, anti-Germany, anti-globalisation outlook is that it gives rise to an anti-EU sentiment that is actually very parochial and very protectionist, and I think we've just had a glimpse of that. And you really saw that in the French presidential elections when the candidates all flitted very easily between being anti-globalisation and anti-immigrant.
If you put the four freedoms up to a vote across Europe, that would probably be about the one thing that would survive a popular test at the ballot box. I think that Britons enjoy being able to buy German cars and French cheese, and I think that the four freedoms are what's best about Europe, and the one thing that if everything else fell apart, I would hope that you would somehow find a way to preserve, because it would make everybody else poorer to go back on that.